we have a panel about discovering the underlying promise of the internet. First, I want to introduce our moderator, Joe Cutler. He's going to be joined by Pavan Agarwal, who you've met before, and Mance Harmon.
Well, good morning, everyone. We're grateful to have you here, and I am particularly grateful to be able to host this panel discussion with Mance and Pavan. I think one of the things that I'd like to start off doing is just do a very simple, I don't know if we have our slides, so we don't. We had one more panelist today, Rich Widman, who from Google, who wasn't able to join at the last minute. And so we're going to pivot just slightly today in our prepared remarks to have a little bit more intimacy with the two panelists that are here. I'll briefly introduce myself. Joe Cutler from Perkins Coie. It's a law firm out of Seattle, and I've been in the blockchain space since about 2010. We formed one of the first blockchain groups of any law firm in 2013 and have been doing a lot of work in the space since. And so I'm really excited about this particular panel because it's more philosophical and more thoughtful, and we're going to get in with two pioneers and long-standing experts in the field to get their thoughts on this interesting question. To my left, I've got Mance Harmon, who he's currently with... Why don't you introduce yourself? Because I don't have my slides, so I'll let you introduce yourself briefly, and then Pavan.
Hello, I'm Mance Harmon. I am the co-founder of Hedera Hashgraph, currently co-CEO of Swirlds Labs. Swirlds Labs builds the platform for Hedera Hashgraph. Background is deep tech for 30 years. Started off in machine learning, working for the Air Force senior scientist for machine intelligence, taught computer science at the Air Force Academy, managed a massive program for the Missile Defense Agency, and then past 20 years, I've been entrepreneuring. So this is startup number 3. Hedera is startup number 3 for us. And happy to be here today. Happy to also say that I'm one of the founding board members of the TBC with Lee Bratcher. We kicked it all off years ago.
Thank you. Pavan?
Pavan Agarwal. I am CEO of SunWest Mortgage and also the founder, creator of Angel AI. I basically grew up in technology since I was a kid, and also because of my family, grew up in real estate, finance. So I bring sort of this unique combination of technology, real estate, finance, and I really think with AI now, we can save about $200 billion a year that's lost in friction cost every time real estate trades.
Thank you. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to start by giving a brief sort of trip down memory lane. And for some of you, this will sound familiar. For some of you, maybe it's the first time you've thought about the internet in this way. The full title of our panel is Fulfilling the Underlying Promise of the Internet, but it has a question at the end. And if you're looking at your agenda, the question is how fulfilling the underlying promise of the internet is going to democratize access to information and ownership of assets. And I thought we'd start with a brief survey of how the internet came to be. In the 1960s, the internet as we understand it started, in the military. And I'm super excited to have someone with that history in mind to talk about that. It was a way of connecting computers together without a lot of the tooling needed to make that ubiquitous. In the 70s, we found the advent of TCP/IP and the invention of IP addresses. And that started to universalize access between machines. In the 80s was the hardware generation, the invention of the personal PC and the software that would allow us to add programming on top of simple commands between computers. And in the 1990s, something important happened. There was a UI attached to it, so that not only was it simple code where you're typing code at a DOS prompt, but you could actually give it to the masses. People didn't have to know how to code in order to use the internet and their personal computer. And the other thing that happened in the 90s was the advent of search, which was the beginning of a trend we're going to talk about. The 2000s were about connections and content. the invention of social media, the distribution of content, and the beginning of putting stuff on the internet rather than in other medium like physical media. In the 2010s, we saw centralization and true disruption. The news industry, the streaming industry, and many other industries succumbed to the power of consolidation of communications through the internet. And even though blockchain and machine learning were invented long before the 2020s, it's my thesis that the 2020s is the period of blockchain, machine learning, and AI really bringing into fruition the underlying promise of the internet over 50 years ago. So it's against that backdrop that I want to start talking to the panelists. There's a quote that I heard that blockchain would revolutionize the world of the world of transactions, the way that the internet revolutionized the world of content and communications. And the reason is because it allowed for the first time to bind the value associated with the transmission of data with the actual transmission of the data itself into one single reportable, auditable, visible, trusted transaction. What is going to happen with that is the question of the day. And so I'd like to start with Mance and maybe tell a little bit about how you've watched against that backdrop the genesis of Hedera come to pass because of the history that I just described.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for the question. I remember starting off in the 80s, as a kid in the 80s, I remember the creation of the earliest version of the internet, quote, quote. It's the CompuServes and the Prodigies and the AOLs. And what was interesting about those platforms is that they were fully closed off. They were sort of integrated in the sense that there was an underlying database that contained all the information. And then there was client software that users would use to access that information. And both the database and the client software were controlled by a single organization, by AOL, for example. In this sense, we called them walled gardens. There's an opportunity to go and play in the garden, but you could only play through the client provided by AOL or in CompuServe's garden by CompuServe. The internet, the promise of the internet was to break down the walls. And what that meant was that there were open standards for separating the database from the client software. Anyone could create their own information and then give access to that information through anyone else, any other organization that creates a client that conform to the standard. It could then access your database and consume that information. That is the World Wide Web, or what we used to call the World Wide Web back then. That was the vision, right? Is everything was broken down. There were no walled gardens. What we saw, and we'll call that Web 1, by the way. So CompuServe, AOL, et cetera, are pre-Web 1. Web 1 was Netscape days and Mosaic, if you remember, back in like 1991 through 93, Mosaic. And then Internet Explorer and on and on. What happened in the late 90s and in the 2000s is that the walls went back up. What we saw was the creation of these massive platforms. The easiest ones to think of are social, Facebook, etc., but they're not just social, but these massive platforms where, again, the information was contained in a database, and the only way to access that information is through a proprietary client. Facebook or Twitter, X, whatever. It's all proprietary. Again, the walled gardens came back. That resulted in the creation of enormous concentrations of power and wealth. The vision of Web3 is to go back to the roots, go back to the vision of Web 1, that being that the concentration of information and access to it should be decentralized in such a way where there are open standards. Anyone can create a client that accesses that information, but more importantly, those that contribute to the database in the first place get compensated for the value created by that database. That's the vision of Web3. So how did that lead us to Hedera? We realized, we recognize that that's a noble goal. That's something that we want to participate in. And so we created a platform. It's called Hedera Hashgraph. It's built on Hashgraph instead of blockchain. But it's a basic, what we call layer one platform that enables developers to build decentralized applications to realize that overarching vision. That vision is going to be realized in every sector of the industry. I mean, what you hear about a lot is the finance sector, but it's much broader than that. It's going to be in finance, it's going to be in real estate, it's going to be in supply chain use cases, and, et cetera, et cetera. Every part of the internet, every sector of society is going to be affected by this technology and this model in this new version of the internet that's being created. And Hedera is one of those players.
Thank you. Pavan, your journey is slightly different, but it ends in largely the same place.
Yeah, so I was building financial applications on the internet, for the internet, back in the early 90s, back when Netscape was, I don't even think they had gone public at that time. And, today, back then, no one is even thinking about how to build an internet application. And I had a fully functioning, completely web-based application. So now the technology I recognized back then, I was just a kid, but I recognized that normal web browsers was not enough. You needed WebSockets. And WebSockets haven't come to maturity until just, past 5 years or so forth. So I built my own WebSocket protocol to get the application to work. And unfortunately, I was just a kid. I didn't know how to monetize that. And I look at today's modern WebSocket protocol, it's the same, almost identical, with a few, differences, but it's very close to what we had built back in the early 90s. So the point is that when you start on this journey, you got to think ahead and you got to think about what is missing, what are the gaps. And right now, what are the gaps that I see in broad-based adoption of blockchain technology, and we were talking about this earlier in the panel, was when I go to a business conference with realtors and bankers and I ask the question, how many of you have a crypto wallet? And maybe a handful of people will raise their hands. And the challenge is the lack of user friendliness of the process. And I think all the level one stuff that's being done in the standardization, that is phenomenal. And the real solution, and I think they're going to become like ISPs were in the 90s, right? And it's just going to be plug and play. But the real solution is everyone having crypto wallet and then everyone learning to control their own data instead of just giving it up to these walls. Because we freely give up the data to Google or whoever, and we choose to be inside the wall, right? The beauty of the internet technology today is we have options. We're not forced to be in the wall. CompuServe, in a way, forced us to be in the wall. Now we chose to be in the wall, okay? And I think blockchain will help us tear those walls down. And it's time to play the Pink Floyd song right now.
Tear down the wall. So let's turn a little bit with, those are the aspirations, right? Like the aspiration is to turn it upside down and give back the control that you as a data owner want over your data. But there are some barriers. There's some reasons why it hasn't just flourished the way that people had hoped it might, in early days. And so let's turn to some of those barriers. It's not lost on us that when free services were offered during that middle era of content and connections, free email, free access to Facebook, free access to social media, free access to applications, and people are not accustomed to paying for the experience of managing their data. But there was a transaction happening nevertheless, right? You were giving them access to a rich set of data in exchange for services. And you've lost some control and some ownership in that process. So as we turn it over, what are some of the barriers that arise that are keeping that adoption, that just let's take it back, from happening?
Well, so I'll state the obvious and then maybe pivot to something that maybe is not as obvious. One, the regulatory environment. The regulatory environment as it relates to digital assets and tokens, etc., is really tough. It's taken a lot longer than we anticipated. When we started all of this back in 2015, we would not have guessed that we'd be here in 2023 still waiting for regulatory clarity. That's been a drag on the entire industry for a very long time. So I think that needs to be overcome. But then outside of that, maybe what's not so obvious is that anytime there is a new technology category that is created through this monolithic code base that is a killer application. Bitcoin is a great example. So Bitcoin killer app started as a single code base, meaning it worked from the lowest levels of the technical stack to the top level. It's one layer thick, and it was Bitcoin. And then over time, what happens is, as an industry, the different layers within that monolithic code base become differentiated. And at each layer, there ends up being competitors that are competing just to dominate that single layer. Today, it's really easy to sort of conceptualize that in that you've got consensus at the bottom layer of the tech stack. And then maybe on the next layer, one layer up, you have virtual machines that run code and that run smart contracts. The EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine, is an example of one of the smart contract engines that exist in that second layer. And there are other smart contract engines in that layer as well. Now there's a whole competition that's taking place for who's going to dominate the smart contracts layer. I predict it's going to be the EVM. Then there are additional layers on top of that that provide other services. And so you end up with this tech stack becoming differentiated with categories that have their own markets of competitors. That represents growth, right? And it turns out that the more layers you have, generally speaking, the easier it is for developers to build solutions. So we're a couple of layers deep at this stage of industry maturity. The next layers, the abstraction layers, are being built very quickly. As an example, at Hedera, we have a consensus layer, and we have a services layer on top of that, one of the services being the EVM. We make it possible for banks or other institutions to build stablecoins. Our earliest banks, it took 6 months to build the stablecoins, their stablecoins, because they had to integrate with other service providers that are part of an overarching stablecoin solution. For example, custody providers or forensics companies that are providing analytics on the data. What we did was create something we called the Stablecoin Studio that pulls all of that information, to all those integrations together into a single, a studio that makes it possible for anyone that wants to deploy a stablecoin to, instead of it taking 6 months, to do so in 3 days with all the integrations intact with all those third parties. That is what accelerates adoption of the tech for the industry, and I think that's the next layer of growth for the industry.
And I think if Rich were here, the one thing that I know that Rich would want us to say is that he would name that sort of the tooling layer. That what they're doing is that you need easy, kind of the tooling for dummies, right? You need to have a one-click or an easy-click access to the tools to onboard your service, so that you don't have to rebuild it from scratch every single time. Pavan, I have a question for you, which is how, and one of the other barriers that I think is a fair one to identify is the challenge that it is to tokenize things. Now, some things are easily tokenizable because they're already near to being tokenized already. It's easy to tokenize an already digital thing, right? It's harder to tokenize something that's physical. A deed of trust sitting in a moldy cabinet for the mortgage industry, for example, or for the real estate industry. So how is tokenization going to go mainstream? Because I think that is one of the underlying questions to the answer of our panel, which is, how is democratization of information or ownership of assets really going to happen? So put on your crystal ball and give us some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I disagree with you there, because another way to think about a deed of trust is a token. It's just that it's a paper token, right? And what we need to do is just make it into an electronic token, which there is a industry standard, non-blockchain industry standard with a centralized database called MERS, which tokenizes the deed of trust. But the ultimately, it's like what Mann said, is the underlying human need is for convenience and simplicity, right? And that's what you've delivered with your product. And if you think about what has caused the big blow-ups like FTX, was people voting against their detriment for simplicity and giving their keys over to this corporation that they have no idea what they're going to do with it, right? So if Sam Bankman-Fried never had your keys, he never would have been able to steal your money. And so you violated the whole premise of blockchain by giving your keys over to somebody else, right? Why should someone else hold your coins in custodian unless there's collateral for debt? So people vote for convenience. And when it makes something convenient enough, they suddenly stop thinking about what's in their best interest. Okay, so how about we create technology that is convenient and secure and keeps the power in the control of the people, right? So, and I think that's where AI and blockchain coming together. And, what we've developed is a chat-based AI crypto wallet. And also it does all of the other financial transactions at the same time. And it tokenizes your credit so that you can literally trade your credit for the highest bidding bank. So you put banks in competition by trading, your virtual identity. So, you may think that your credit is completely data, it's completely virtual. It's not a physical asset, contrary to your premise. But actually, tokenizing virtual concepts has real world economic impacts on hard assets today.
It's a great point. We gonna add something?
I'm happy to. So I think it's clear at this point that we're going to live in a tokenized world. Everything you see and touch, everything of value is going to have a digital twin. And the way I think that that's going to scale up is through supply chain. So we have a user of Hedera called Atma.io. It's Avery Dennison. It's a global company. They're a supply chain company. And they are processing billions and billions of transactions on Hedera today, where their supply chain customers have product flowing into their supply chain. That product is tokenized. As say sneakers, as an example, get produced, the sneakers end up having a token associated with them. Those tokens can interface through the decentralized finance tech stack, meaning that the tokens associated with the sneakers can be traded for stable coins in a programmatic way to fund the capital, to provide funding for operations. As the sneakers get ready to ship, the pallets of sneakers have tokens that are traded again for an AR, an accounts receivable, from the distributor that is buying those pallets of sneakers. The ARs programmatically get factored again through the DeFi tech stack, and in return, they get more stable coins to, again, increase free cash flow. That's what the future is going to look like. And because of that, everything that you see and touch is going to have an associated token. What we've seen so far is just the tip of the iceberg. Even if we forget about pictures, right? Forget about apes. Even if we look at the tokenization of financial instruments, as we've seen through KKR and maybe real estate, et cetera, all of that is just the tip of the iceberg to what's coming.
And so, Pavan, you shared an analogy that we wanted to attribute to you, but you said you heard it from someone else. It goes right along with what Mance was saying, which is, tell us a little bit about this analogy, and I'll share it. You said that machine learning will do the same thing to a lot of white-collar activity that robots did to what we used to call blue-collar industrial activity. And that concept of, pushing to machines what machines do best, just a short snippet, talk about that a little bit in reaction to the idea of adoption. Where is the world going in the near future because of machine learning and blockchain together?
Yeah, so I'm at these conferences quite a bit with business people, real estate and finance professionals, and my advice to them is always don't be afraid of AI. Be afraid of the person next to you who's using AI, because that's the one who's going to take your job. Right? So, and same thing with software engineers. I know there's a lot of engineers here today. I've been writing code my whole life, and I find that 95% of the time I'm writing code, I've always looked at it and says, why can't this be automated? And because the real work I'm doing is the 5% of thinking and creativity, and 95% is grunt. So now with these generative AIs, we're getting rid of that 95%. So you got to really focus your talents and skills on creativity, innovation, design, and engineering. And that's what's happening to the financial services space in mass right now. We've converted, in my mortgage company, we converted all of our operations staff, right? Underwriters, processors, closers. We've converted them all to either customer relationship building or data engineers.
It's a great point. Well, we are nearing the end of our time, so I'll just end with this, where we began. We started out with a survey of the internet's history. And one of the things I like to leave people with is this concept that helps them realize that we are kind of where we are. And if you think about the arc of the internet from its very, very beginnings, just connecting one computer to another with a wire, to where we are today, I think it makes a lot of sense to say that we're just beginning to be in somewhere near the 90s of that arc, where there's a lot of underlying technology. It all works independently, but the UIs, the connections, the search, the intercontinent, all the tooling, that's what's coming next. And so for you venture capitalists out there, it's not blockchain or machine learning, it's both. And I think that that's really the message we wanted to share, which is that the powerful combination of AI, machine learning, and blockchain together really has the power to catapult the internet to that fulfillment of its promise. Pavan and Mance, thank you so much for your time. We're out of time, and we will sign off.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you guys. Well done.
Hey guys, thanks for coming out to the 2023 North American Blockchain Summit. It was the best summit yet. We look forward to hosting you again next year. If you enjoyed the summit or like what you saw in this video, be sure to subscribe. If you're interested in learning more about membership in the TBC, go to texasblockchaincouncil.org to learn more.